Okay, it's follow-up day here. We're with Craig Wiggins, the sprinter on the ARA team. He was on the shiny yellow factor last year, and this is the new machine. Same size this year. With most of the stuff on the bike is unchanged. We have got a more steeply angled stem on this to get him low in the front end, which has improved his shoulder and neck comfort hugely. Most of what you'll recall from the initial video we did with Craig was his symmetry issues. So we're here today to evaluate how he's gone with that. He's still been getting some one-sided saddle discomfort problems, we shall say. So we're going to have a bit of a look at him and see how his symmetry looks first, and then we're going to go through some other possibilities for what could be causing this asymmetry, because this one has turned out to be really, really deeply ingrained into you. It's been with him for a long time. Craig's had some of this even before he had the accident. So we'll see if we can find what's triggering this at its root cause and see if we can come up with some solutions, because so far we seem like we're about 50 or 75% better. We'd like that to get to 100%. We'll see how he looks. So this is hugely improved symmetry. Craig looks pretty damn good, I must say. He's got a tiny little bit of that obliquity left in his pelvis. It's at least 75% better than what we saw on day one. So a huge improvement. This could just be a matter of more time is needed to help keep his, to help his body gravitate back towards really good symmetry. Or it could be that there's still a little piece of the puzzle that we're missing somewhere. So I'm going to have a look at Craig again off the bike now and try and figure out if anything has massively changed in his physical structure or in his functional structure of his muscle system, that kind of stuff, and see if we can figure out what's underpinning the last little bit of this asymmetry. But overall, a massive improvement, and he looks really good. I'm surprised he's getting any symptoms at all from this. But we'll see how he looks off the bike and see if we can come up with a solution. Now, what else could this be? All right, bend your legs up towards you. Let's check the basics again. So bum up off the ground and then back down again. Zip. Whoa, okay. That is way better than before. So your hip range of motion has improved substantially on that right side, which usually implies that the sacroiliac joint is moving better, which is good. Okay, it's still vaguely different. Flip over onto your front for a second. Let's check your SIJ range out. That is neat. That is neat. It's perfect. Okay. Your sacroiliac joint is rotating perfectly, but your hip range of motion is still asymmetrical, which implies possibly that you may have a retroverted femoral neck. Flip back over onto your back again. This is something we didn't think of. So underpinning the rest of this, we can see that when we look at this hip's range of motion, it's got about 30 degrees of external rotation and about 45 degrees of internal. This one has got a solid 70 degrees of external rotation and 15 of internal rotation. Now the curious thing, usually what this means is that Craig's pelvis is twisted. However, what's actually happened since we saw him last is his sacroiliac joint on the right is now moving beautifully. But the difference in the range of motion of his hips is exaggerated. It's actually gotten worse, which is very unusual. I would have expected that to become more symmetrical, but it's become less symmetrical. Now this may make some sense, and what could be underpinning this is that he may actually have an asymmetry in his hip joints, which has then created a whole raft of functional side effects over many years, which has then led to the pelvis being twisted. And my initial assumption when we saw him was that his pelvis was twisted, and that was it, and that was what was causing all of his issues. But there's another layer to this. So what this may mean, if this hip has got so much less external rotation and so much more internal rotation, one of the possibilities is that the ball and socket joint is actually tilted differently in the pelvis on the right side. If the right one is what we call anteverted, if it's rotated forwards, this is how the person will present. They will have much more internal rotation on one hip and much less on the other side. Usually, as I said, it means that the pelvis is actually torsioned, but this is the other possibility. These are very, very very rare to have an actual structural anteversion difference. It's the sort of thing you'd usually see in someone having a hip replacement, for example, and the orthopaedic surgeon hasn't put the hip joint in on exactly the correct angle and it's different to the other side. But to see it in a healthy, young, normal person is a bit unusual. So there is a solution to this. What this means, weirdly, is that Craig's left hip, the one with more internal rotation, that hip joint, if we cut him straight down the middle, that hip joint would sit, or the femur, because the hip is twisted inwards, the femur would sit closer to the midline of his body than his other leg. What this means is that there's a reasonable justification to test him with a staggered Q factor and a staggered cleat position, which is one of the things we've already done. We've staggered the cleats fore and aft, and that does help. And strangely, it doesn't feel strange to you, does it? It actually feels generally better in every sense. The other piece of this puzzle may be to stagger the Q factor. This is one of the very rare cases where you would consider running Craig's left foot closer to the bike than the right foot. So we're going to test that right now and see what happens, because this is a very, very unusual pattern. But this could explain a lot of why this has been so difficult to get rid of over the years and how it got into that situation where it was twisted. Because as we've evened up your pelvis, the asymmetry in your hips is actually worsened, which is very, very unusual. So let's have a look. There it is. It's the first time I've seen you sit square on a bike, Craig. So yeah, no wonder we couldn't pick it. No wonder we couldn't pick it, because it wasn't just a torsion in the pelvis. There's another layer to it. This could have just been years of sitting twisted on the bike has twisted your pelvis. And the years of sitting twisted on a bike are from this asymmetry in your hip joints rather than being a cause of them. That is pretty crazy. Does it feel different?
Yeah, it feels like I'm pedaling down.
Yep. Look at that. It only needs 3 mil too. That is mental. Now, I'm not surprised we couldn't pick it. I haven't seen one like that for like 4 or 5 years in a young person. It's one of the first things you think of when you get a rider who's had a hip replacement, but not like this. Like, it was the last thing I was thinking. So no wonder we couldn't pick it. This is one of the most unusual asymmetries I've seen for many, many years. I just finished explaining to Craig, I have not seen another one of these in a young person with no major history of fracture or trauma to the pelvis or the hips for 5 years or more. So he's actually got a retroverted femoral neck on the right, and an anteverted femoral neck on the left. Now, what that means is his two hip joints are physically different. They are like this relative to each other. And so what we've done is we have moved Craig's left foot 3 millimeters closer to the bike to suit the narrower Q factor that his left leg will function with, because the leg is sitting closer to the midline of his body, and he looks absolutely brilliant. So looking at him from above, this is the first time I've seen him sit perfectly square on a bike. And that is the last piece of the puzzle. And what this means is that Craig's pelvis, when we initially saw him, was twisted not because of the accident. His pelvis was twisted from years and years and years of compensating around this asymmetry that he's got in his hip joints. And so we assume that his pelvis has been knocked out of whack because of that, and that was the only layer of the problem. Turns out there was another layer underpinning this, and this, I'm hoping, is the last piece of the puzzle, because he is sitting beautifully square on the bike now. It feels quite strange, doesn't it, Craig?
Yeah.
Yeah. The last thing you would ever think to do is to actually stagger a person's cleats sideways. This is the sort of thing you would only ever think of doing with someone who has had a hip replacement. But in Craig's case, he's like this from the factory, as we say. A flawed specimen. But a beautifully symmetrical specimen now. That is fantastic, mate. And your glute is engaging properly on the right for the first time. So very happy. So a great example here of a multi-step bike fit. This is, Craig just said to me, this seems like a multi-step process, and I think he's right. This is a great example of why this process can drag on for months or even years if we've got a highly asymmetrical person. We're trying to undo all of this stuff in their body. It's like layers of an onion. You peel off one of the layers, you can see what's underneath. And what happened here was layered on top of this asymmetry in your hip joints was a pelvic torsion. My impression initially, and I was wrong, was that that was the sole problem. Turns out there's another layer underneath. And like we said before, as we untorsioned your pelvis, the hip joint difference became larger. It was supposed to get smaller, which made me think maybe he's got two different hip joints. And that's what's actually going on. So if we x-rayed Craig right through the front, we would see that his two femoral necks, one of them is either shorter than the other or one of them is inclined on a different angle to the other. And this is creating the need for a staggered Q factor and a staggered cleat position. So we did half of this last time. We staggered his cleat position fore and aft, and he was much better. But the last piece of the puzzle, now that his pelvis is untwisted and I've actually figured out what's going on, is that we've also staggered his cleat position sideways. So his left foot is closer to the bike. And as you'll see from the top-down footage, he looks beautiful. This is the first time I've actually seen him sit square on a bike. So this is going to be a bit of a different experience for you, Craig. Hopefully no more one-sided saddle problems, mate.
Yeah, lovely.
Fingers crossed. And we'll do another follow-up with Craig potentially in a few more months and just make sure this is held. And I'm going to get him to do a little bit of experimentation with how much of a stagger to put in. It could be 3 millimeters, which is what we've got at the moment, where his left foot is 3 millimeters closer to the bike than his right, or it could end up at 4 or 5 optimally. So a little bit of experimentation to get it perfect. And Craig's really good with sensing this asymmetry in him. So I'm going to let him do that out on the road. But now that we've figured out what needs to be done, hopefully that last little bit of tweaking, that's the last thing to do. So there you go.
Lovely.
Cheers, mate.